great ceiling painting, and this in a city, Vienna, 1900, which is riven with anti-Semitism. And that is where this man, my great-grandfather, who didn't want to be a banker, who didn't want an inheritance, had taken over this imperial, extraordinary, Austro-Hungarian Habsburg dynasty that stretched from Russia to Vienna. And he's getting married. He's getting married to Emmy, my great-grandmother, who was not educated, but loved dressing up. And there she is, in a characteristic mode, and here she is dancing by Olbrich, secessionist, a family album that my father found in a paper bag under his bed. And here she is, like everyone should be, dressed up as Isabella. And here she is with her lover, an archduke, in 1899 on a street in Vienna. And Charles gives this extraordinary collection of Netscape to this young couple. And where do they put it? In this ridiculous palazzo. They give it and put it in her dressing room, where she spends most of the day, getting dressed and getting undressed. And that's important because that's the moment and that's the place where the children, this is my grandmother Elizabeth, spend their time. The only time that they ever see their mother is when she's getting dressed and undressed. And this is the city. This is this extraordinary house. And this is the city in which these young Jewish children, Elizabeth and her younger sister Gisela and my dear great-uncle Ignacy, spend their time. And what do they do? It's a cultured family. They go endlessly. This to the opera. This is her opera book from 1916, the Berg Theatre. Look, this is how you should bring up your children. How much culture? I've got a son in the audience. This is how they were brought up, love. This is my grandmother Elizabeth, the oldest one, who gets away. She gets educated. She becomes a student at university. She becomes a poet. She writes Tarilla. She writes novels. She gets away from this extraordinary, claustrophobic, cultured, rich family on Marienstrasse. And Iggy, my dear great-uncle, gets away too. He's gay. He runs away from these demands. He goes off and becomes a fashion designer in Paris. He proudly says, the worst fashion designer ever in Paris. And you know what happens. You know what's happening. And that for me, the pain of this book, 3 years in, I'm desperate to see my family and desperate to make pots to get back to my life, is how do you write about what happens in 1938? How do you find a way of talking about what happened to this family alongside every other family in Vienna who were Jewish? How do you make this story clear? Because at this moment, this isn't the glittering story about acquisition, about bringing things into this great vitrine of a house, this great extraordinary place. But how do you write without nostalgia and without sentimentality, but with rigor about the events that happened? Because exactly 75 years ago, last month, hour by hour, over 3 months, a city turned on itself, and every single Jewish household was dispossessed. Because that's what the book is about. It's about what you have and what tenuous grasp you have on your possessions, on what possesses you and where you belong. Because within hours, the house was looted, and my family was beaten up, And then within days, there was this incremental pillage, this incremental violence against a family, which is the violence of separation. You separate people from what they own and how they identify themselves. And then you separate a family from itself. And then you separate a family from a community, from a city, and then from a country. And it happens in Vienna, hour by hour by hour. And the story of how they escaped, and how my great-grandmother committed suicide as a refugee, and how my great-grandfather Victor ends up in Tunbridge Wells in suburban England in 1939 with my family, my father as a young boy, and the life he makes in this suburban villa without his wife, without his library, which he had seen taken out of the Palais and put on a truck and driven down the Ringstrasse. And what he does is very, very difficult to write about, but it's the heart of the book. And what happens? Well, Iggy, the gay fashion designer, the man who ran away, joins the American army and fights for D-Day, and here he is, and he named his Jeep, which he fought all the way across Europe, liberating Paris on the way, and he named his Jeep after his sister, which I find, for some reason, incredibly moving. And after the war, my grandmother goes back to Vienna to a ruined house, to a house which has been emptied. And in that ruined house in Vienna, something extraordinary happens, an encounter happens, something is given back, and the thing that is given back is this extraordinary inheritance, this collection. And I don't feel I have to go through that whole story with you tonight because I will just weep, so there you go, you're not going to get it. But the Netske are given back. They're the one thing that remains out of this extraordinary, vast empire of possessions. And the one thing that survives is something that actually they truly possessed, which was a sense of who they were as a family. And Iggy, in 1947, sees an attaché case with his Netske rolling around him. And my grandmother says, what are we going to do with these things? These one things that connect us with Paris, with our mother, with our childhood, with happiness. And Iggy says, in a moment of clarity, this dispossessed man who doesn't want to live in Europe, he says, I'm going to take them home. And so in 1947, he takes the attaché case. It's a fabulous story. He has no reason to go to Japan except these Netske. And he goes to Japan, very good, well-dressed man, who's always telling me to straighten my tie and polish my shoes. And he goes to Japan, and here he is with Japanese friends. And here he is with his Japanese partner, Jiro, who he lived with 50 years together. And he builds a house for the Netske. He builds a vitrine for them. He gets them all out. And you know what he does? He has parties and he hands them round. Because that's what they're for. They're for handing from one person to another. This happened with Proust. This happened in that house. It happened with Manet. They were passed from one person to another, because that's what happens when you pass an object together. But here in Japan, that's what he does. He and his partner Jiro open up this vitrine and hand them round.